think 2020, by its very nature, has been a year of disruption. But from an Indigenous point of view, I think it's been quite interesting to watch the disruption, particularly in the media space. And, you know, from calls of more diverse people in newsrooms to more diversity on screen, to Indigenous people and other people of colour sharing their stories of what it's like to work in mainstream media organisations. It's something that you might have missed while the global pandemic was on. But I watched it sort of start to play out on Twitter in early June when Yukon morning host and Indigenous Canadian broadcaster Christine Grenier resigned over the suppression of Indigenous and Black voices at Canada's national broadcaster, the CBC. And in a statement on Facebook that she made after her resignation, Grenier said the CBC's journalistic standards and practices perpetuated systemic racism. And I quote, blocks our ability to bring the stories and language and culture to the programming. The on-air statement and resignation sparked other former CBC staff coming forward and telling their own stories of their experiences inside the organisation, which was happening under the hashtag on Twitter, Black in the Newsroom. By late June, Australia saw SBS staff urge leadership change from former journalists sharing their experiences. And then in August, David Whiteley, known as the announcer Sideman, quit Radio 1 Extra, one of the BBC's digital radio stations, over the BBC's use of a racial slur in a BBC News report. And for me, it was empowering to see those in my industry who'd experienced what I had also been, experiencing while trying to do my job, speak up in an effort to bring real change in a sector where particularly Indigenous voices are still trying to be heard. And that leads me into IndigenousX, which is trying to create a stronger table with many seats at it, rather than just a seat at someone else's table. Now, Luke, I want you to think all the way back, and I don't know a lot about younger Luke, but I want to know in this moment about what it was that you consumed in your household in terms of media when you were growing up. I mean, what were those things that you watched, read, or did you even do any of that?
One of my earliest media. Oh, and just before we kick off, I'm in Wabagul country for anyone who's curious down in Newcastle. But yeah, one of my sort of earliest memories is I was about 3 or 4 years old watching F Troop, old country and western for those old enough to remember. And come running out into the kitchen saying, when I grow up, I want to be an Indian just like Dad, because there weren't many Aboriginal people on. So I saw what later in life turned out to be white people in redface, but it was like not white people. That must be what Dad is. And that's the first time that Dad apparently ever told me that I was Aboriginal as well, in terms of having had a conversation about it. But, growing up, I think, like a lot of people of my generation, born 1980, I watched a lot of what my parents watched. Like, we only had a few channels. I was out on a 500-acre property. We didn't have a lot of media. We were down at Video Easy every weekend renting the movies. Didn't watch a lot of news. I read a lot. I read a lot of comic books. I read encyclopedias. I read a lot of Stephen King. I read, probably a lot more American than Australian, apart from the encyclopedias. I was, loosely aware of major events happening, but I certainly wasn't a day-to-day consumer of Australian media.
We go to the IndigenousX story, which pretty much grew out of a hashtag on Twitter to this online independent Indigenous media company that it is today. I mean, how did that happen? I mean, what was those various points in this journey that you've had so far?
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, and I would find it weird that you're even on the call if you don't know, but IndigenousX is the world's longest rotating Twitter account. We were the second in existence after Sweden, but they hung up the towel a year or so ago and we kept going. So we've taken over as the longest running. And it's just a different Indigenous person each week. Take the account and do your thing. The account was born out of an era. When are we talking, like 2012? NCIE was sort of new on the scene, IndigenousX, Indigenous excellence, trying to shift the narrative, positive conversations and not just deficit discourse. And so IndigenousX very much came out of that space. And actually at the time, like when I first created the account, IndigenousX, I sort of said to NCIE, like, I just created it before someone else did. You can have it if you want, though, because it's kind of, you guys like the hashtag is very symbolic of what you do. And they're like, no, we don't want it. We've got the NCIE account. And I was like, well, if you don't mind, I might do my own little thing with it. And they didn't mind. And so I took it. And then it was actually at an NCIE event where there was a bunch of young ones. And I was like, I don't know, the idea just sort of came to me that, yeah, I didn't want to just do, I didn't want to be one of the things that I was identifying were a problem in the space, which was not enough people having a voice. And I was, coming up quick in the rise of the blogosphere and the rise of Twitter as a commentator, as someone who had opinions. And I guess, media considered me media friendly enough that they would ring me up for various things. But I didn't want to be that fella. So I, created IndigenousX and tried to create a space that we could all come to, even if only for a week. And almost 9 years later, and it's just, I don't know, people must like it. We're still here doing our thing.
So, Luke, I mean, what do you think social media and particularly Twitter allowed IndigenousX to do?
Just doing our own thing on our own terms. Like a lot of when, there'd be, and you still find it a lot, but a lot of non-Indigenous people, like I've never heard this before. I've never thought of this before. And for a lot of us, it's like, we have, we've heard it before. We've said it before. We've done it before. So I think it just sort of opened up, to non-Indigenous audiences, something that was very common with Indigenous people, and that was just plain talking Indigenous perspectives. But amongst ourselves, though, the opportunity, like I've met so many mob, yourself included, who we would have never crossed paths if it wasn't for Twitter. Like I was a failed primary school teacher. My next path was manual labour. I wasn't going back to teaching. I'm not qualified to do anything else. So I would have just gone and done whatever I could. So I would have faded away. So it created a space where people like myself could build something out of nothing. Could find an audience, could find other mob to connect with. Just more for fun. Like no one started on Twitter back then trying to be a influencer, or we didn't talk about ourselves as our personal brands and all of that sort of silly stuff back at the start. So it was just a bit of fun. But I don't know. I think when I think about IndigenousX as media now, one of the big things is we helped disprove this idea that audiences want to hear about Indigenous people and not from us, in that carefully constructed deficit discourse or crime story or, poor bugger me or whatever it is that what the white gaze wants to shine a lens on. We're able to go, but like we're also interested in all these other things, and a lot of the stories you tell are complete nonsense, and here's why. So just offering that rebuttal and that space for new conversations, it didn't exist. Not in any mainstream. I don't say that wanting to disrespect, the strength of Indigenous radio or Koori Mail or mob who were having those conversations. And white fellas could have tuned into those, they just didn't. Twitter, I guess, just put it a bit more directly in front of their faces.
I think part of the appeal of Twitter has been that anyone can have a voice, that anyone can have a say, that anyone can, can use that in any way that they want to, and that maybe that lack of control is what mainstream media is not completely certain of, because they don't have control over that space and what happens.
Yeah. I think there's lots of things about Twitter a lot of people in mainstream media don't like. Some of them probably very legitimate at that. But a space where you didn't have to be picked by the old guard, a space where you could just carve out a niche for yourself. That takes away those restrictions. So, you see various people who probably should not have a platform popping up. But, there's a strength in not having to go through the old guard when we know that the old guard traditionally have been very racist, have been very sexist, have been very homophobic, have been very transphobic, and have actively kept people out of these spaces. And now that we have an environment where we can make connections with each other, we can build our own audiences, we can curate our own stories. There's something just beautiful about that, even with all of the horrible stuff that comes along with it.
So, Luke, I mean, how do you think that you've disrupted that media landscape with IndigenousX? What is it that you've brought to the table that you think?
I wouldn't want to take too much credit for the change that's popped up in the last decade. like I said, it was the rise of social media, the rise of the bloggers, the rise of so many things that we were just a part of at the right time. But, you know, I think our partnership with The Guardian, which was very early in the piece, that came only like a year after. And that, you know, it's something I've said, you know, a lot of times before in a lot of different spaces. So I apologize for anyone who's heard it before. But yeah, the moment The Guardian did a partnership with us where they said every week, every host, we're going to give them the opportunity to put their opinion on the Guardian website, that instantly made them the largest publisher of Indigenous voices from non-Indigenous media. No one was publishing, you know, up to 52 different Indigenous voices in an opinion space. No one. And so that was revolutionary, and that I think helped, you know, pave the way for people recognizing that there is opportunity, there is interest in. I think we've seen a lot of people, you know, piggyback on that. I think a lot of people sort of foolishly run into that, inviting Indigenous voices in while not letting them be themselves. And I think there'll be a big teething issue as more Indigenous people move into mainstream spaces. I think a lot of them, you know, see something like IndigenousX and they're like, oh, we want that. But then the realities of what, you know, they should do when they have Indigenous people on board, I don't think they're ready for that reality.
Interesting that you should mention that, Luke. And I wonder if, you know, you spent time working at both SBS and the ABC. And I wonder, you know, what kind of work you did at both, but what you saw in that time, as well as what the reality was of being an Indigenous staffer in that space.
Yeah, it was quite surreal for me. You know, like I said, after I left teaching, I never really planned to have that sort of public service type job ever again. But you know, when my daughter was on the way, I sort of panicked and was like, I need a real job. So I gave up on running IndigenousX day to day. And you know, that was actually Jack Lattimore came in. You know, was amazing. He basically took over for a year or two there when I first went to NITV. I went in as their senior digital producer. And it was a really cool experience for the most part. I mean, you know, news were over there doing their news thing. I was kind of brought in because NITV's digital outside of news wasn't great. Their social wasn't great. So I was largely given free run. I hadn't really seen behind the scenes. So, you know, it was weird, like having a non-Indigenous boss in an Indigenous organization was weird. But to their credit, they kind of, for the most part, just let me do my thing. You know, the fights I had to fight at NITV were more with SBS than with NITV. So there are stories I've told in the past where it's like we had to advocate for why we should be able to say the word white in terms of white people. It's like, well, if we can say Aboriginal people and we're referencing that as distinct from people when we mean white people, then we need to be able to say white people. I had to actually go back through the old Human Rights Commission and find some old case of some random white fella who tried to say that white is a racist slur, and that got thrown out from the Human Rights Commission as not being racist under the Racial Discrimination Act, and that was the leverage we got to be able to say the word white, or you know, not being able to say Invasion Day, which happened like a couple of years in. So there were some really weird things that, you know, were disappointing. But for the most part, I loved my time at NITV. I loved working with black fellas and, you know, with Indigenous journalists who actually, you know, are skilled at being journalists, when I was more just a guy who knew how to tweet and is decent with words, you know, sometimes. So yeah, I loved my time at NITV.
And so then you left, is it right that you left NITV and SBS to come to the ABC?
Yeah. So I got headhunted back when Lorena Allen was still there, and she brought me over. And it felt like a natural progression, you know, go get some more skills, go learn a bit of audio, move into radio and other opportunities. And for me, it was really about that, you know, because I was running the digital, I didn't feel there was a huge opportunity for me to move in any huge direction. If I was going to move anywhere, it would have been to TV or to news, and I don't like the idea of being on TV or on news. So radio was very appealing. And yeah, I regret that move immensely, to be blunt. I had a horrible time there, just absolute terrible time.
Yeah, so I mean, I know one of the things that I wanted to ask you about around your ABC time very much was, I mean, how did you deal with having that non-Indigenous editorial line for the stories that you were writing at the time? I mean, it was very different to what you'd come from NITV/SBS.
Yeah, and at NITV it was great because like largely I was the editorial line. If I thought I was pushing the envelope too far, I would ring or reach out to Tanya, who was like the boss of NITV. And again, to the credit of NITV, every time she was like, "This is great, run it, and if there's a problem, I'll talk to whoever has a problem with it." So Tanya was really great with sticking up for me, and I did some pretty cheeky things when I was over there. And then I came over to ABC, and I would work with Lorena, and Lorena was such a great mentor. She would take the time to bring out the red pen and show me how to write beyond blogging and actually structure something properly. But then after that, it would quite often have to go through RN Radio National. And that's when I'd have young non-Indigenous followers having a look at it, and they're like, "You can't say this, you can't do that," and I just really struggled with that. One of the things that always sort of stood out was this idea within journalism of you don't have to get a quote or use a reference for something if it's universally understood. If you say water is wet, you don't have to go and speak to a water expert who will quote and go, "Yes, water is definitely wet." So there was one thing that I'd written in an article that was like, Aboriginal people commonly experience racism. And they're like, "Oh, no, you can't say that. That's not universal knowledge. You've got to get someone else to say that for you." And previously in other articles, I kind of, path of least resistance. So I would ring up friends or the people who were being interviewed and go, "Do you mind if you say this? Because I've said this and I'm not allowed to say this. So you need to say that." And they'd be like, "Yeah, no, that's fine." But that's such a dodgy thing to do in the first place. And to have to do something is so intimately dodgy. But that one, I really sort of lost my cool on and fought and did eventually win. But it was such a pointless fight. And so I went from writing weekly and curating and editing and commissioning everything that was going out. Like I said, that wasn't news. Was my eyes were over it in one way or another. I maybe wrote 10 things in the year or more that I was at ABC tops, and I'm not exceptionally proud of anything that I did while I was there. So it was
that
very
a hard experience, Luke? Because I can imagine coming from NITV and SBS, where you had largely a bit of autonomy in terms of what those stories were that you were sending out. I mean, those stories were doing very well online. They were doing very well on Twitter. They were sparking conversations. To then coming across to a place that didn't seem to understand what it was that you were doing.
No, well, and it felt, and I think the thing for me was that sense of it was against what I was trying to do. Whereas NITV was very much like, we'll make a path to let that happen. Whereas, Lorena 100% was in my corner. A few other people, socially were very much in my corner, but as an institution, I did not feel that the ABC wanted me there. And there were various individuals and times and moments where that was profound. And so, by the time Lorena got poached by The Guardian, I was like, well, I'm done too. And I left pretty much immediately off the back of Lorena because it was once she was gone. I just did not feel particularly safe in that space. But oddly, that said, I kind of felt at the same time, I could have just sort of sat in the corner and not done much. And I don't think anyone would have minded. I think generally the organization was at its happiest with me when I was just sitting around not doing much.
I suppose that's a hard one to reconcile sometimes when you're in a space like that and you're trying to work out the reason why you want to be in a space like that and what it is that your job is, which doesn't necessarily, I mean, you don't verbally have those conversations with people when you have your own mission for being there, which largely is always about visibility of your own people, largely about getting the stories and voices of your own people out, and then having to deal with that on top as well. I mean, what did you make of that? And do you think that's something that we don't talk enough about, is the reality of what it takes for us to do our job in mainstream media organizations on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, for me, because I'd left teaching after 3 years, and I often talk about how I really enjoyed the classroom, but not so much the staff room, with again, some notable exceptions of some older non-Indigenous women who sort of took me under their wing. But I didn't enjoy my time teaching. And so when you leave after only 3 years, as much as I felt I'd been pushed out, indirectly. No one was, actively pushing me out, but I certainly felt I didn't fit, and so that I was forced out in that sense. You do leave with a bit of a feeling of failure. I spent longer at university to become a teacher than I spent teaching, and so all of that, trauma, for lack of a better word, sort of reopened up within my time at ABC, and I think I internalized a lot of it. And like I said, I mean, I certainly didn't kick goals while I was there, so I don't think it's unfair to say that I failed in what I'd hoped to achieve while at the ABC. But now that I'm a few years off the back of that, and we're kicking goals again with IndigenousX, it's kind of like, I did fail in my time there, but I was not supported to succeed. And I think that's just such a common story of Indigenous people, unless you're a particular sort of person in a particular sort of role, with a particular support network around you. It can be very hard. And I was in the Indigenous unit, for God's sake, so it's not like I was the only blackfella in the building. But just that having to deal across the aisle, it just was not a place that I ever really felt safe. And like I said, I don't know how long I stayed after Lorena left, but it was not very bloody long.
In that, in what you've experienced, like, I mean, what do mainstream media organisations need to understand in terms of how to use their Indigenous staff and what it is that their Indigenous staff do for them?
I mean, I think it depends on which ones we're talking about. 'Cause like I said, there's been such a push of Indigenous staff across a number of spaces, whereas, again, Lorena as an example over at The Guardian, like kicking goals all over the place. She's winning walkies every other day, doing these big projects. And so, she's got that support and that opportunity to be scoping out what she's doing and going and doing it. Whereas other people, who I know in places, I don't want to find myself in any defamatory space, but other people in places you thought would be doing well, are not, and are not getting that same level of support. So I think it's those people who are inviting Indigenous people in at a social capital level, or very much that idea of, like I said, for me, it really felt like I was poached because I was good at what I did, and then I was put into a space where I wasn't allowed to do what I did. And so for me, it's like, why would that was just such a wasted thing. And didn't feel that I was given the opportunities to do other things, and didn't feel safe enough to try. Very quickly I sort of collapsed in on myself, became quite insular, and then just waited out the rest of my time. So I think, for so many places, it's like you can say, get an anti-racism training or get you, but it's like, really, if you're not culturally safe, if you don't actually want Indigenous people on our own merits, but you want that social capital, or you want that diversity tick, or because you've been funded to hire an Indigenous person when you've been around for 100 years and have never hired an Indigenous person before, then good luck to that person, and you just hope that they're really committed to do what they do, because we will put up with a lot to chase our dreams, because that has always been the price of success in white institutions for Indigenous people. It's swallow all the crap, do the extra labour, and persevere, hoping that the people who come after us don't have to do it so tough.
Hoping that change comes as well, for the change that you're trying to make internally as well. It makes me wonder on that, when you talk about, when you were, the way that you were not really utilised in what it was that you're doing, putting a, to use the term, a square peg in a round hole in a way, so bringing it back to IndigenousX, I mean, do you think that's the beauty of IndigenousX, is allowing the Indigenous people that you have coming on to work for you and to contribute for you, that it's about them being true to themselves, them being true to being Indigenous people, but a space that allows them to do that?
Yeah, that was very much the vibe. We didn't really think a lot about the non-Indigenous audience when we started. I still don't necessarily. A lot of our relationship with non-Indigenous audience is like, it's your job to work it out. And so in the first couple of years, we were pretty heavily policing our own space in terms of, don't come and ask those generic ask an Aborigine questions. Don't ask a question relevant to the experience and the knowledge of the individual and what they're saying. So they're on stage on IndigenousX, they're talking. Don't come in with a question that you have always had. You're having a conversation with an actual real person. Don't just go, oh, I've always wanted to ask an Aboriginal person, any Aboriginal person, this question. Actually talk to the individual as an individual. And people responded to that, and over time, got really, really behind that, and that became the core audience of IndigenousX, Indigenous and non-Indigenous followers who picked it up, who supported it, who make it special. But it really was just about having that place for mob to go. You can actually say something to an audience without having to feel too much like you're automatically speaking on behalf of all Indigenous people, which again is so often been. And you would have seen it. I couldn't tell you the amount of times I've been in an interview and so on. Just like, so what do Aboriginal people think about whatever the thing is? And it's like, that's a bad question. You shouldn't have asked that, and you should have known that's a bad question. What do I think about it as an Aboriginal person? Not what do Aboriginal people think about it. So yeah, I like to think with IndigenousX we've created that space. I mean, ups and downs, peaks and troughs, roundabouts, swings and roundabouts. But I think most people who've come on and hosted have had a good time. Maybe a bit of a stressful time with such a large audience that people aren't used to, but have at least felt confident in the knowledge that it's their week to make of at their own discretion.
Obviously adding all of those different voices that you get on as part of the curating and who those people are that are tweeting from week to week adds to all those different voices and different opinions. And I suppose, is that part of it, of being able to show the diversity that exists within our own communities? Yeah,
well, breaking down that homogenous view of Aboriginality, that pan-Indigenous view of Aboriginality, that sense of who's the most authentic voice, just the fact that so many Indigenous people socially will encounter where they will share an opinion and a non-Indigenous person go, oh, but I met an Indigenous person who had a different opinion and I'm very confused by that, and which one of you is right? As opposed to, it's like, no, well, that's my opinion and the person you're talking about, that's their opinion. You shouldn't be confused by the idea of two Indigenous people with two separate opinions. We are not a homogenous group. And that's so much of our criticism of media over the years has really been about those terms, like the use of Indigenous leader or Aboriginal leader. That's not a real thing. We don't have that as a pan-Aboriginal group where we've all put up one central spokesperson as a leader. I've been referred to as a leader, and that's just hilarious. But yeah, I think that not just what we've done on the side, but being able to in real time critique mainstream media in a way that they have never had to deal with before. So I think most non-Indigenous journalists, on TV, editors behind the scenes, and you didn't know who an editor was at a newspaper back in the day, where suddenly they've got a Twitter account and I can find that fella and go, man, you're the editor of this national newspaper. Why don't you put a capital I on Indigenous? They never had to deal with that before. And they had to deal with it a lot because of the rise of Twitter. And, that was something I did a lot of over the years as well. So, and I'm quite proud that we've annoyed them enough that whether or not they've changed it because they understand why, or whether they've just felt compelled to move with the shifting sands. You rather people do it because it's the right thing to do, but ultimately just do the right thing. I don't particularly care what your motivation is.
That leads me into, I suppose, what you think the effect has been of particularly the Black Lives Matter movement going global. But obviously here in Australia, we've always had Black deaths in custody. And what you've seen in the space of what it is that you're trying to disrupt, of how that has impacted on the way that things are happening at the moment. I mean, I obviously noted in introducing what we were talking about a little bit of some of those things that have played out on Twitter involving Indigenous journalists, Indigenous people working for media organisations, as well as other people of colour. Not a word that I like to use, but I don't know what other word to use really at the moment to acknowledge those who are also having similar experiences as Indigenous people. But yeah, I mean, what have you seen, and what do you think the likelihood of the momentum is?
Yeah, well, I think there's so many different angles and so many layers that we need to think about. So I think for Indigenous people particularly, it resonated with us. Police brutality, deaths in custody are not new issues, not new campaigns for Indigenous people to push. So the boistering of that as part of a global movement was very powerful for a lot of people. but also, as you would know, like there is something just very real about other people, sharing your pain, sharing their pain, coming together around, even though, so many different aspects to how it resonates globally in every different country, but there's that shared reality, there's that shared goal. So I think for a lot of Indigenous people, one, just very draining, but also very empowering at the same time. So I think a lot of people, just stood up that bit taller, spoke that bit louder, pushed the envelope a little bit further around how much we tailor our language to cater to wide audiences. I think people got a bit stauncher, and for me as someone who, like, I've offered anti-racism training for a very long time, and we don't get a lot of clients, or we didn't traditionally, because people wanted cultural awareness training, not anti-racism training. And just seeing people going, no, we actually want that. Not really knowing what it is until they actually sit down in the room. But most people, not enjoy isn't the right word, but what I mean? They engage with it in a way I don't think they would have a while ago. But that's very much at an individual level. Organizations who are jumping on it, you don't know the difference between an organization who's doing something so like, well, everyone else is doing it, maybe we can sell more, whatever the hell we're selling, versus an organization who people at the top are like, no, we actually want to help influence change. And so I'd say it's way too early to say that there's any, cultural shift long term that's come out of it. And being the cynic that I am, I'm always very much like, wait and see. We will see it through their deeds and not just their words. And so a lot of organizations who would have never supported something like Black Lives Matter a few years ago, and certainly have no track record of supporting Indigenous issues. But, the fact that it's like in Australia, Redskins, Chico Babies and Coon Cheese are all changing their name. It's so surreal on one level, because it's like, no, we want police to stop killing Black people. That's what this is about. But also when it comes to those name changes, like, you knew about that. This is, you didn't just because of Black Lives Matter go, oh yeah, no, you're right, we should do, like, you should have known, and you did know, but now you've made this change. And while I'm glad the change is happening, I'm still, I'm cynical. I don't know. History will be the judge of the power of what's happening now. But I'd much rather see, I got invited on ABC radio, right, in the height of the protests in Australia and America. And the producer was like, because of Black Lives Matter, we want to get you on the show to talk about dual naming of place names. So you got the white fella name and the Indigenous name. And I was like, how about because of Black Lives Matter, you have someone on to talk about Black Lives Matter and talk about police and protests? Like, why that? So, people looking at it as picking content. Like, oh, let's have this completely tame and unoffensive conversation, rather than having the real conversation, but being able to say they're doing something for Black Lives Matter. Like, I've seen so much of that. Sorry. Went off on a bit of a rant.
No. So you're not ranting at all, Luke. It's all very important. I would never say that you're ranting, not just because you're my new boss, but it makes me wonder, of what you've spoken about there, about what you think makes change and impactful change.
Change makes change. It's, all of the words, and we're seeing it now with people just like, certainly mob. If you're paying attention, you'll know this to be true. People are sick of RAPs, reconciliation action plans. They've been around a very long time. They do bugger all. You can have a good one, but you can have a crap one, and no one really knows the difference. So you have change by changing what you do, and so much of it, of having the anti-racism conversations, you're seeing white people starting to say, we need to be made uncomfortable. We need to be having the difficult conversations and the uncomfortable conversations. Well, you go with those non-Indigenous bosses and say something uncomfortable about the realities of what needs to happen, and watch how quick they still shut you down. And so, they're starting to embrace the language and use the rhetoric, but institutions, corporations, governments, media have always been remarkably adept at co-opting the language of the oppressed, and not changing. Change comes from change. And for what we try to do, like you said with the introduction, I'm of that generation who was like, If you want to make change, you do it from the inside. You go get your uni degree. You know, I was going to make change in education as a classroom teacher, and maybe over a lifetime I would have become a principal or into the department or whatever. But you know, that's not where, like, the change that occurred to allow me to become a teacher didn't just come about from people inside. And that's not to disrespect the Aboriginal teachers in, you know, Torres Strait Islander teachers in the past who have put up with that crap in the classroom, but a lot of it came from protest. A lot of it came from advocacy. And so there needs to be a understanding and a working together of the people who are outside, you know, making the wave. They also need to be the ones riding the wave towards change, and not just, I think we've gotten to a point where there's such a huge discrepancy in it so often between the bureaucrats who get to negotiate on our behalf and the mob who protest down the streets to give the bureaucrats leverage in the meeting room, where they used to be the same group. You know what I mean? Like the mob who protested in the 50s, in the 30s, they were the same group who would eventually go and sit at the table. Now, a lot of the time, you're lucky if they know each other. Very rare that they talk to each other, and generally don't like each other. And that's worrying for me. So, you know, for IndigenousX, the fact that we can do our stuff, but we don't necessarily have to engage too much within the bureaucratic spaces. We don't have to, like, I don't want to go negotiate with the Liberal Party about the things I write about. I just love that I've created a space that I can say what I think is true for those people who want to hear it, and the other people who want to share their truth. So I don't know that we're trying to affect change in that direct action kind of way. Like, you know, I wouldn't say we're protesting. I wouldn't say we're bureaucrats lobbying. We're somewhere in between, where not that I don't, you know, believe in change through lobbying or change through protests. I attend protests. I support mob who are protesting, and I support mob who are lobbying. But I don't want to do either of those things as my core business. And I love that we live in a world. I love that IndigenousX has created a space where we don't have to pick sides about what's the right way for change. We don't have to, you know, we don't have to cut out one group of mob and say, oh no, you're sellouts, or you're radicals, or you're this, or you're that. We can just say, you know, anyone who wants to speak their truth and, you know, hold to some journalistic standard of truth telling, have at it.
Just sort of in reference to time, Luke, if any of you have any questions, please put them in the chat, particularly if you have questions for Luke. Would appreciate that. Luke, it makes me think, just on picking up on something else that you said, it makes me wonder, you talked there about having stories that are done in a journalistic integrity type of way, and that framework. But if we look at that framework is very Western in its concept to start with. So it makes me wonder, I mean, do you feel, and I mean, have you explored a way of what does the Indigenous journalism experience look like? What does the Indigenous way of telling those stories?
When I say that, yeah, a level of journalistic integrity, like we don't actively enforce that with most of our right, but it's more of like, is what you're saying verifiably false? Because if so, then that's a problem. So, you know, we, as much as we have a platform where it's like we invite Indigenous people to tell their stories, if someone was to come up and be like a proper QAnon type, we'd be like, yeah, no, we're not publishing that. If someone, or even not just, you know, factually untrue, but also unethical, like, you know what I mean? As much as we represent the diversity of opinions within community, and different communities out there, like we were very much like, we're not publishing articles from people who are saying we shouldn't allow same-sex marriage. We don't, like, so we do draw lines around that, and we do have standards. And so, yeah, how much those are journalistic standards, I don't know how much they are just a basic, like, we don't have a space where you can tell things that are blatantly untrue, where you can actively lie or cheat or try to unfairly manipulate for outcomes that you don't believe in. So if that's, I'd hope those are journalistic standards, although I didn't do a journalism degree.
It's okay, Luke, they are.
I hope so. Yeah, looking around the landscape, they don't seem to always be. But, you know, I think that's just my personal ethical compass. And because we're in media, I call it journalistic standards. If I'd stayed in teaching, I'd call it education standards. And you would hope that they would align well.
Just because this conversation series is all about the retrospective work of Gordon Bennett that's currently on at GOMA, and I it made me think about Gordon Bennett and how he used his art as a way of disrupting and commenting on what was happening around him. And I wonder, you know, why do you use media and IndigenousX? Is this your way of doing it?
Yeah, I was, very much playing in the sandbox and seeing what I could build. But I really love. I was having a poke through the online Gordon Bennett experience, the exhibition Unfinished Business, and there's this awesome quote that's up on the wall there. I've got it up here. He said, "I'm trying to paint the one painting that will change the world, before which even the most narrow-minded and rabid racists will fall to their knees. Of course, this is in itself stupid, and I am a fool. But I think to myself, what have I got to lose by trying?" And there's just something really nice about that. And I think, I certainly think about some of the articles I've written in the past that were probably far more ambitious than the cynicism in me would ever have say, why bother writing if people wanted to know this, that already know this. But you do. You hope, like, racism is just so nonsensical. It's so ludicrous. And we know that it's not just about ignorance, it's about power and control. So a lot of people who push racist narratives don't do so because they're ignorant. They do so because they can exploit that lie and they can profit from it. But somewhere, and again, that teacher in me is like, surely there's a combination of words that I can structure, that I can put together without going, no, I've got to admit you're right, racism's stupid. Let's give the land back. It does feel silly, but I love, God, if we're not trying to do that, then what the hell are we trying to do? I don't know.
Well, Luke, I might go to some questions now that have popped up in the chat. Donald asks, was the original concept for IndigenousX to educate people on Indigenous issues?
Hey, Donald. Like I said, no, that was more incidental. Like, we kind of knew that it would, and we didn't shy away from that. That's cool. But in saying that we were doing that, if we had have gone, that's what our goal is, I think that would have been disrespectful to the hosts and counter to the vision of, like, you as an individual Indigenous person don't need to have all the answers, and it's not your job to educate. So the education for non-Indigenous people was not specifically to be educated on Indigenous issues, but by hearing from a different Indigenous person each week, you would break down some of your misconceptions. So in that way, there was a goal to educate, but not on Indigenous issues in that way of, like, this is an online Aboriginal Studies 101 class or anything like that. Certainly
not. Dr. Sandy O'Sullivan has a question, although I think you may have just answered that. Sorry, Dr. Sandy, we had asked a question about op-eds. Dr. Sandy did have another one, sorry, which was just asking about the theoretical QAnon person. How would you feel now about having a really controversial figure hosting IndigenousX?
Well, it's funny what is considered controversial for us might not be for others. So, for us, when we had Warren Mundine host, that was a very controversial week for IndigenousX. A lot of us do not like Warren. And I'm pretty freely critical of a lot of stuff he says or does online myself. But at the time, that was kind of important that we didn't fall too much into a space of, it's that tricky balance between who are we to judge who is an acceptable Indigenous voice versus the reality that we do have to make certain judgments around certain individuals. So, there might be a certain level of criminal record or a certain level of online behaviors that we would have to draw a line at and say, no, actually, you can't host. And that's really scary for me. Like, I've literally never said no to anyone who has asked. And I used to be very proud of it. I say, like, anyone come and ask. But over the years, we find that it's like, actually, no, our duty of care to mob overrides that core principle. And so, as much as it would break my heart, and I think it would be a very sad day for me and for IndigenousX if I ever had to say no to someone, seeing the rise of certain online voices who bully mob or who are particularly homophobic, or, like I said, a person who had such a horrific backstory of damage against other Indigenous people that I just couldn't in good faith champion their voice, we would have to say no. And wouldn't hesitate to do it, but I would still hate to do
Michelle has more of a comment, but definitely I think I've got a question off the back of this. But Michelle wrote, I grew up listening to a personality on commercial AM radio in Perth called King Billy Coke Bottle. As a child, I used to think it was an Aboriginal person. It was only as I got older I found out it was really awful parody by a middle-aged white dude. When Noongar Mob campaigned to get him off air, the PC outrage from the media was the same back then, 40 years ago, as it is now when the mainstream media is called out for racism. And I suppose just off the back of that comment from Michelle, I wonder about, those responses that come up. I think we've seen some of those more recently, particularly with the criticism around the ABC's 2021 programming lineup, where they were called out for a lack of diversity. They then responded about their diversity and inclusion policies, put out a number of other different publicity tiles showing the diversity that they had lined up for 2021. But the responses that was seen in that, I mean, what are some of those typical responses that you see when it's about that PC outrage by mainstream media in a way when racism or something else has been called out?
Well, I think that justification of like, oh, but we do this, there's this idea of like, and this is the origin of the, but I have an Aboriginal friend, therefore it's impossible that I am racist, because a racist hates all other people of all other races all the time. So by having one Aboriginal friend, that is proof. I therefore cannot be racist. And I think within a corporate space, it's like, here's our diversity promotion so that we can promote our diversity. And here's our real lineup of our best stuff. And they got called out because their real lineup of their best stuff was all white. And so then go, oh, but we've also got our diversity stuff. That's like, yeah, you don't consider that your real stuff. You don't consider that your best stuff, or it would have been on your tile. And that's, so then people go, oh, but, do you then tokenistically pick one of those to be on the tile when they don't think that's their best? It's like, I'm not going to tell you how to lie to pretend to promote diversity, but you should, like, the fact that that's your worldview is innately problematic. If you can go, oh, the 12 best things are all white, that's shit. You should know better. Not just for the optics of how the community are going to respond, but because it is in and of itself shit. So, that pushback, and I mean, so much of it, I think a really important point there in sorry, was it Michelle? The comment of, not knowing that people objected to it. Like when the Australia Day stuff, Invasion Day, Change the Date campaign, or picked up on social. I did a bit of radio on it at the time, and I can remember one fellow, I don't remember his name, but a white fellow on a mainstream media thing was like, in the last couple of years, we've been hearing about this change to the, and it's like, and Indigenous people have been talking about this for 100 years. You've just only started listening to it 2 years ago. So you think it's new. But, the first day of mourning, 1938, and that wasn't the first, Indigenous anything that said Australia Day is crap. That was just the first large major gathering that put out the 10-point plan. But, that's almost 100 years of campaigning against it. But your average person out there wouldn't know. And that's, I mentioned this on Twitter recently. There was an old article from Celeste that she did about a survey we did showing that a lot of Indigenous people didn't support Recognise back in the day. And it's like, 87% of people like don't actually support it. And then at the end, it was just like, and you would know that if you listened. And that just always really resonates with me of so much of what we do and what we deal with is it's like, none of this is revolutionary. None of this is new. None of this is hard to find. And you would know if you listened. The people who are like, oh, I didn't learn it in school. I wish I had it. Such a shame. We didn't have Aboriginal studies in school. It's like, but you have Google now, right? Like you have books. You can buy things. Like we aren't hiding these perspectives. And when people come and say like, oh, how can I learn? And I'm like, freaking read a book, read articles on our website, and you can see that disappointment. It's like, oh, I'd much rather sit on the dirt and have an elder hand out the chunk. And it's like, you got to earn that. You don't just get to buy a ticket to that. Like, and the reason we write down knowledge is that I don't have to say it 1,000 times. 1,000 people can read it once. With 3%, we don't have the time to sit down on the dirt with everyone on country and show them that way. Not to say, you shouldn't be out learning culture on country, but politics, history, Indigenous voices, we're out there. We're very easy to find. Not being taught it in school is not an excuse. Never was.
Luke, I might just, just to wrap up this conversation, what does the future of Indigenous media look like for you?
Um, Looks like something I've never thought of. And it looks like the young ones coming up and being able to take platforms like IndigenousX for granted and go, like, it's awesome that we have these. Now let's do something better. That's what the future needs to look like. And if I'm mapping out the future, then that's a problem. I'm not a huge fan in those who sort of gamble with the chips of the next generation. I think there is a time when I would like to think that I've done enough that when I'm older, young ones come up will go, Luke, what do you reckon? But they don't have to. That's their generation. They can work it out. And if they want to learn from what we've done and they want to build on that, then I would be honoured. That's that whole be a good ancestor sort of business. But at the same time, like, that's their future. I don't want to write that. My kids will tell you that in 20 years.
We do have a late question that's just come in from Michelle again. She says, Luke, I'm interested in your thoughts on cancel culture.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure that it's a thing. Like, I've certainly called for a lot of people to be cancelled, and they're still around. So if cancel culture was as good as it's cracked up to be, Andrew Bolt wouldn't have a job. So I think when you see a lot of those sort of mainstream people criticize how horrible it is, it's like cancel culture has always existed. It's just that it was institutionalized. So, we saw this in the Me Too movement. Like, how many actresses had their careers cancelled because they didn't sleep with old mate, what's his name? Like, how many Aboriginal professionals didn't get a job or didn't get a promotion because their white bosses wouldn't give them one. They had their careers cancelled. Cancel culture has always been a thing. Now there's also the opportunity for this sort of amorphous mob to rise up in the moment, for better or worse. That mob is not, and that's where it lacks the institutional rigor that people go, oh, but who are you to decide? It's like, well, who was that racist CEO to decide? Who was that racist prime minister to decide? Who was that sexist, sexual harassing movie producer to decide? So those gatekeepers and that cancel culture has always existed. Now there is just the rare opportunity that the masses get to decide in one way or another. And even then, they don't get to decide. They just get to create enough pressure that the same old gatekeepers sometimes go, yeah, we should probably listen to the million people online who are hashtagging about this racist, sexist idiot, and get rid of them. And then usually they go get a job, write a book, and get a conservative.
But just to push you a little bit more on that, Luke, I mean, if it's always existed, but it's obviously just a bit more public now in a way, is there still a double standard in who gets cancelled and who makes a comeback?
Oh, hell yeah. In so many ways, like I was just saying, like, a lot of the people who are cancelled were never actually cancelled to begin with. Like, if you can go and write an op-ed about how you got cancelled, then you probably didn't get cancelled. So I think there's again, how great racists are at co-opting the space. Like PC gone mad. It's the fact that racism has been able to create a narrative that Aboriginal people get all the things for free. It's like, damn, you are really good at media spin, because we get bugger all, and yet you've created a narrative. So they've done the same with cancel culture. They've made it out to be this huge weapon that it isn't necessarily, or very rarely does it action. But like I said, I mean, there is, of course, always the reality in that space, the same as there is in a court of law, that people will eventually go, oh, we probably made the wrong decision there. That person, maybe something was out of context, or that, I don't have any examples of where that's happened negatively. But responsive online movements that are amorphous, it's not what you would necessarily put forward as the best decision-making body, obviously. But like I said, it's now just another player in the space, and I think it's certainly more a force for good than not. But it's also a very capitalist reality of, boycotts work. People have business models. If you take away their business model, they will adapt. If we didn't click on racist things, if no one watched racist shows, then they've got to be self-funded, which is where we found ourselves in the awkward place in Australia. You don't actually have to listen to the racists, and they will still just be funded by right-wing interests who will keep them on air whether we like them or not. But for most people, they've actually got to make a living. We certainly do.
And Luke, just on the back of that, I guess, for those who are tuning in terms of, how do you disrupt the media? What would you say? What are your final comments around that?
Speak your truth. Hold on to your guns. Don't be afraid to not point out the elephant in the room just because no one else is. But that said, be prepared to occasionally be wrong and to learn. Do the best you can, that when you step up and speak your truth, it's not just what you feel is the truth, and it's actually something you've checked is true. But yeah, just keep doing it. Rally with other people around you. But like I said, be willing to be chipped and to be pulled up, because I think that is such a powerful learning tool. As I think if I'd never been chipped from the time I started this, or from the time I was a young fella, I'd be pretty loose. I'd be pretty arrogant, and I'm already pretty bloody arrogant. So I think you've got to keep yourself humble however you can, whatever grounds you. Don't get caught up. Like when I started IndigenousX, I was online 12 to 18 hours a day, all day, every day, and it was not good. And I was slowly burning out, and finding ways to connect back to culture, ways to spend time on country, ways to spend time with other Aboriginal people, not just online. And then in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, with family, having kids, like they keep me grounded. So yeah, don't burn yourself out for the cause if you don't have to.